Okay, so we might have a few people still jumping in, but I would love to welcome Callie and Michelle from President Lincoln's Cottage as we talk about their next session. I will turn it over to you both.
Great. All right. Can everybody hear me okay? Yep, wonderful. Hi, my name is Michelle. I want to quickly introduce myself and my colleague and go over what we want to accomplish today before we really get started. I also want to invite anyone who'd like to put their video on. Since we are talking about empathy, we want to connect, but I understand if you don't want to do that. I knew that I was being recorded on Zoom today. Not all of you knew that, so I'm not going to take it personally, but if you do want to come and join your faces, I'd love to see them. But again, my name is Michelle Martz. I'm the Visitor Services Manager at President Lincoln's Cottage. I'm going to be presenting today with my colleague, Callie Hawkins, who's the Director for Programming at President Lincoln's Cottage. And we've been at the Cottage combined 18, going on 19 years. And President Lincoln's Cottage, if you don't know, is a historic house museum located in Washington, D.C. And historically, it is where Lincoln spent about a quarter of his presidency. And we consider ourselves a home for brave ideas. And that's not just for the brave ideas that Lincoln developed at the Cottage, like the Emancipation Proclamation, but it also includes the brave ideas that our visitors discuss, debate, and create there today, right? So when we think about the Cottage, in order to sustain that work of being a home for brave ideas, we are committed to cultivating empathy and working to sustain it amongst our staff, especially our frontline crew, because they are working with our visitors who we want to cultivate and sustain that empathy with as well. So during this session, we're going to be talking a lot about empathy. If we had to count how many times we use that word today, I wouldn't be surprised if it gets pretty high. But we want to define it. We want to talk about why it's important for museum staff to have it. And we also want to give you really practical ways to exercise empathy and build it amongst your team. And at the end, we want to make a commitment to act on empathy, that it's not just an idea, but being empathetic is actually an action. So before I turn it over to Callie, I just want to get started as we're getting some more people into the room and people are settling in to really bring ourselves into the moment. It's mid-afternoon here. The sun is shining on the East Coast where I'm at. And since it's mid-afternoon, I know we've all done a lot today. And it's all of that has brought each one of us here to this moment. So let's just together take a long inhale in. And let it out with an exhale. All right, I'll turn it over to you, Callie.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Did that hurt anybody else to take a deep breath? It kind of hurt me a little bit today. And I don't know if it's that I've already participated in a Zoom board meeting for 3 hours this morning, or if it's the anticipation of talking about something that's so important to us. But thank you, Michelle, for that reminder to take a deep breath. I think it's such a good reminder to be present and in this moment when there's so much going on outside of the walls in which we're, between which we're sitting. We've come to call that everything that's going on outside. We refer to that at the Cottage as nesting dolls of crisis. And there have been so many times over the past few months that I've felt completely alone, even though I share my home with my husband and show up to umpteen Zoom meetings each day. There are some days that the isolation is just all encompassing. Has anybody else felt that? It can be overwhelming sometimes, I think. And so what I'd like for us to do right now is another sort of centering exercise. I don't know if you have a piece of paper or a pencil, or you can just, sit there with your thoughts. But for the next minute, what I'd like for us to do is think about all of the people who are making this moment right now possible for you. And so what that might mean is, unless you are a computer engineer moonlighting as a museum professional, you know, chances are you didn't create the computer or develop the internet that you're using to come into this moment. You probably didn't, I know you didn't invent electricity, but you probably didn't bring the electrical wiring into your house either. So just think about all of the people that have gone into making this particular moment possible for you. And I'm going to give you a minute to do that. See how many you can come up with. Take another 20, 30 seconds or so. Is anybody surprised by the number of people or the number of things that you were able to come up with? I think it's really crucial to do exercises like this to help us recognize just how interconnected our lives are with other people. And I think that when we can create an awareness of that, we can really start to see how important relationships, those that are seen and those that are unseen, are in helping us and supporting us in going about our daily lives. It's also crucial to helping bring our attention to the fact that we too play that role in other people's lives. So you never know if you know someone you contributed to something, you might end up on their list. And so I think it's just really important to thinking about that. And I want to sort of use that exercise to set the stage for our conversation about infusing our workplaces with the practice of empathy. And one of the things that's been really important to Michelle and me as we've pivoted to online programming during this pandemic is to acknowledge that most of us are conducting business and connecting here today from our homes. That's the case for me. Raise your hand for those of you whom we can see if you're doing this from home. And you know, we know that our homes can be sacred and intimate spaces where we can be our truest selves. And we really appreciate you inviting us into your home today. Home is something that we think a lot about, and what it means to people is something we think a lot about, since we work at a historic home where Abraham Lincoln lived and did some of his most important work. And we also understand how upending it can be to have these spaces transformed from where we live to where we live and work and educate and command crises and so on. And Lincoln would have understood that too. He did all of that from President Lincoln's Cottage. So what I want to do is just ask folks, if you can, to put in the chat the first word that comes to your mind when you think of empathy. Doesn't have to be a full-blown definition, but what comes to your mind when you think of empathy, and what feelings does it sort of evoke for you? I love connection right off the bat, and compassion and kindness. These are beautiful. One of my favorite definitions, and you can keep those coming, but one of my favorite definitions that I've come across for empathy is the quote, capacity to understand the thoughts, feelings, or emotions of someone else. And I think that we could add any and all of the words that you have put in the chat to that, to expand that definition quite a bit. Empathy is really something that Abraham Lincoln was adept at. And to demonstrate that, I'd just like to share a brief letter that President Lincoln wrote to a young woman who had just lost her father during the Civil War. And, you know, just keep in mind that this was 1 week before issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. And a week after a crucial Civil War battle. And so, you know, as we like to think about that, there wasn't a whole lot of time here that Lincoln had on his hands, and he took the time to write this letter. And so as we're thinking about Lincoln and empathy, just listen to this. It was written from the Executive Mansion in Washington on December 23rd, 1862. It says, "Dear Fanny, it is with deep grief that I learn of the death of your kind and brave father, and especially that it is affecting your young heart beyond what is common in such cases. In this sad world of ours, sorrow comes to all, and to the young it comes with bitterest agony, because it takes them unawares. The older have learned to expect it. I am anxious to afford some alleviation of your present distress. Perfect relief is not possible except with time. You cannot now realize that you will ever feel better. Is not this so? And yet it is a mistake. You are sure to be happy again. To know this, which is certainly true, will make you some less miserable now. I have had experience enough to know what I say, and you need only to believe it to feel better at once. The memory of your dear father, instead of an agony, will yet be a sad, sweet feeling in your heart of a purer and holier sort than you have ever known. Please present my kind regards to your afflicted mother. Your sincere friend, Abraham Lincoln." I really love that letter when thinking about Lincoln as a leader, as a husband, as a father, who, as he says in that letter, surely knew what he was talking about. He was a man who had experienced great grief and great tragedy in his life, and who could show up for other people in theirs. And I think that's an important part of empathy when we think about it. And I think when you hear letters like that, you know, and you think about Lincoln the man, it would be really difficult for us and maybe a bit disingenuous to interpret President Lincoln's cottage, a space where Lincoln grieved and laughed, made impossible decisions, and played with his son, without really talking about empathy and practicing empathy. And we believe that this is something that a lot of museums do really well in a visitor-facing way, but we want to encourage this for ourselves and for our staff. Why should we have to all leave our fears and worries and joys at the door and pretend like we are not real people working at these sites with real challenges? So this is something we've worked hard to make a habit of our practice in ways that Michelle is going to focus on as we go on. So thank you.
Thank you, Callie, for all of that. And I think your last point is really strong, is, you know, whenever I hear about empathy in the museum, it usually, first off, it's about the visitor and having empathy for the visitor. And what I want to focus on is how can we have empathy for our teams, and our staff, volunteers, for the people making all of this work. And so how I kind of see this presentation is going through some practical applications that we've been using at President Lincoln's Cottage. And I see them in 3 different chunks. I see them through the hiring stages, the training stages, and then sustaining. So hire, train, and sustain for empathy. So we'll just start where it kind of seems to begin, at hiring. Because we can start to look for staff members that maybe already have some empathy or have the capacity to cultivate a deeper level of empathy. And we actually do this right up front in the interview. We ask questions that help us understand the emotional intelligence of the candidate, so that we are seeing how they might fit in with the existing team. And, you know, with that, we want to be able to see, can they have emotions, different types of emotions, and can they describe that to us? So one of my favorite questions that we ask in the interview is, please describe a place that is important to you and why. So I'll let that just sink in for a moment. Please describe a place that is important to you and why. This happens to be the very first question we ask in our interviews, which is a little disarming. You know, it's not about the candidate's skills. It's not about their job history, references. It's not even about Abraham Lincoln. It's personal. And when we ask this question, we are looking for candidates that can evoke an emotion and help us feel something for that place that they're describing. So we're actually not looking for the historic content of a place, even though we're a historic site. You know, they could tell us about another historic site, but I'm not looking for that history. I'm looking for that connection, which was a word that a lot of you put up in the chat. And I'm looking to connect to that site, that place. So I actually love when this happens in the interview, when they stop, they take in that question and they turn to us and they go, does it have to be historic? And we immediately are like, no, absolutely not. And we have people sharing stories about, you know, the park that they go have lunch in, and they share about how they love to watch the seasons change, and how the change of seasons and how that feels. That gives me a much better picture of them as a person and how they relate to spaces than telling me about, you know, the Civil War history at a site, right? And so with questions like these, we can start to understand, who do we have in front of us and how are they going to contribute to the work that we're already doing at President Lincoln's Cottage. And I know that we could all take a moment to just kind of brainstorm. I know that there's a lot of different people on this Zoom, and that have different roles and responsibilities at their sites. So I want to take just 30 seconds to a minute. I'll time it. I might even put on some music, if I can definitely know how to do that. For you to brainstorm, what's a question you could ask that gets more to emotional intelligence for a job? So I'm going to go ahead and start the music, see if you guys can hear that. And I'm just going to set the timer for just about 30 seconds. And if you've got a good question, just go ahead and throw that up in the chat. Great. These are really, really wonderful. Laura, I love, who do you consider a hero and why? I actually wrote that one down as an example for myself. And there's really some great ones about seeing how people can connect and tell stories, which is definitely something we're going to be talking about in just a moment as well. I like Alyssa asked them to describe one of the most exciting events in their life thus far. I like that one a lot as thinking about, like a question you could ask is, how do you celebrate success for yourself and maybe success for others? We know that empathy is really built. There's actually much stronger connections when you can celebrate a success for someone else than venting in a negative experience for them, which is really fascinating. Tell me how you helped a visitor. I love all of these. And so these type of questions can help us really understand who are we interviewing, and what is their depth now in emotional intelligence, and where do we see where we can take those as well. As we think about hiring, we also need to think about training staff for empathy. And a big part of empathy is emotions. And, I think very often when we talk about empathy, we actually don't talk about that we need to have actually a pretty decent vocabulary within ourselves of our own emotions. And how do we describe our emotions? And that's really important to, I think, the work that we do at the Cottage, and I think in maybe the history field, but right, any museums, we're talking about culture and we're talking about people, and people are emotional, and history is emotional because it's what happened to people and how people reacted. And we tell a lot of stories at President Lincoln's Cottage. So in training, we actually start off with understanding different emotions by defining them. And we get out, you can see this in a variety of different forms, but I specifically use in training a feelings wheel. If you've ever seen one of those, it really is a big pie chart, and it is cut into pie pieces, different emotions that are then broken down into smaller pie pieces. So you could have the emotion sad, and that's broken down into depressed, tired, fatigued, hopeless, right? Hopeless and fatigued are two different emotions, right? And they're much deeper than sad. And I'm very sorry that I went negative on this. I definitely should have probably done like happy and proud, thrilled, excited instead for this, but that is exactly where I went first. I'm sorry. But when you're thinking about that, that's what the pie wheel can show us, that these emotions aren't, this surface level. We can get much deeper, and those are where those human connections are made. So we take our knowledge of emotions, which I use the feelings wheel, but there's other great examples of like the mood meter that uses emotions based on your energy levels and positive and negative, kind of on an XY axis. If that's something that, if you're more mathematical, that might work more for you. But I've also just seen lists of emotions, right? Like a vocab sheet. We take those emotions and then we break down the visitor experience. So for the Cottage, we might just do the tour for the people giving tours. And it's like, okay, so how do you want someone to feel in your introduction? How do you want them to feel with the stories being told in this room? Now this room. And they pick one emotion for each room. Now I want to also do this for other visitor experiences. It could be, thinking about the visitor flow. When they arrive, how do you want them to feel? When they first engage with you, how do you want them to feel? When they enter the museum store, how do you want them to feel? And so once we've chosen a feeling, then we can start to break down, all right, how do we get them to feel that way? So when they first interact with you, you say you want them to feel comfortable. Well, what are you going to say to them to make them feel comfortable? When you were welcomed into a space, last time you were in a space that made you feel comfortable, what happened? How did someone make you feel comfortable? What tone did they use? What did their body language say to you? So that way we're breaking down empathy into real actionable items that they'll be able to do when interacting with visitors. And there have been times when I've had them do this with interacting with each other in spaces, so as teammates. And I think that's really important as, as we think about these moments with our staff, is thinking about, okay, what's the emotion that I want to feel and how can I get to that point? So what I want to do now as I'm looking at our time is I want to go through a few more tactics with us as well, because I want to allow time for some reflection and some questions too. If you do in the meantime have a question that just kind of pops in your head, Callie and I are monitoring the chat. You can absolutely type it in there. We'll be looking for those. Another tactic that we use to check in for understanding when working with staff that give tours or work with school groups and programs, but I can absolutely see this in visitor services as well, is what we call the 10-word story challenge. And this gets us into kind of a creative realm for checking for understanding and meaning by assigning part of the tour, the visitor experience, and having them write down in 10 words or less. You can always go under, you just can't go over. What's the main point that we want to get across to the visitor? I'll give you an example, one of my favorite examples from a former colleague, and she was explaining what the cottage meant in general. So yeah, she's taking the history that we can, you know, do multiple presentations on, and she got it down to 10 words. And to give you a little background, Lincoln had called the White House or Executive Mansion an iron cage. So I can just right now tell us all how Lincoln felt about that place. And so she wrote, "Away from the iron cage, his ideas could be free." I love these 10 little words. None of them are big because it paints a picture for me. And now that I know that she absolutely understands the point of the cottage, right? And she also kind of made me feel something. I know what it feels like when I've been caged up, maybe metaphorically, and when I kind of feel that release of freedom. And that's maybe what Lincoln felt like when he got to the cottage, right? So there's creative ways that you can do this. We use the 10-word story challenge. I could see haikus being in there as well. So lots of different ways you can check for understanding, but allow the creative process as well. Yep, exactly like an interpretive theme. I just always love to shorten it down to 10 because that moment, right, we could all go crazy with the amount of words on our lists. Now, sustaining empathy. I think that's a really important conversation, because especially now with this dual pandemic that we're all in the midst of. So I want to talk about maybe 2 tactics that I use the most on a daily basis with staff, and then just talk about what I've been doing through our closure to the public, and then we are now reopened to the public for our frontline staff. So a daily tactic that I really like to sustain empathy among our staff is what I call the 3 text compliment. We've all been here where we've had you watch a staff member walk in and they look miserable, right? Their heads are down, they're shuffling their feet, shoulders forward. We know that they are already starting the day off in a negative headspace. We also know what it's like when you watch a staff member return from a school group that was maybe extra rowdy and they look absolutely exhausted and drained, and you know that they have to go back into another school group that just showed up. What I like to do is I like to engage with that staff member and say, hey, I know you're going through a lot right now. We don't necessarily have to talk about it, but I want you to just take the next 5 minutes. I'll cover whatever you got going on. And I want you to get your phone out and text 3 people in your life, 3 different compliments. So you can text your mom a compliment, text your best friend a compliment, that friend that you've been meaning to connect with, send them a compliment. And the reason why I have them do that is empathy is about connection, right? And by sending those compliments, you're reminded that you are connected to people, that despite what work is throwing at you at the moment, right, you have people that you love and love you back. And we know scientifically, and I'm pretty sure everyone here knows personally, when you do something kind for someone, you always feel better, right? You feel good. That's why volunteering is something that people do. Yes, it's good to put good into the world, but you actually feel better when you volunteer and when you're kind to people. So it's a great, quick tactic you can do to help turn around the emotions in that space of the staff. Another thing I like to do daily, in just kind of that daily moments, is reframing. And reflections with our staff about how they're interacting with visitors, how they're interacting with each other, with me, and getting them ways to realize that they are connected to this bigger picture. So any chance that I can get to that more human experience. So an example is, right, a visitor has a really negative tone with our staff, and through reflection, we realize that that visitor was late for their tour. And we can then ask ourselves questions like, well, have I ever been late? What have I done when I'm late? How do I feel? Do I feel frustrated? Am I mad at my husband because he's the reason why we're late? And then I took it out on someone else. I definitely took it out on him too. Was that kind? How are those emotions? How do they make us react? That's no excuse for having such a nasty tone with our staff, but it is more of an understanding. One of my favorite ways to also kind of provoke understanding, especially with staff members who tend to be extremely self-critical, that's myself included, people who take things really personally and criticize themselves internally a lot, is to ask them, how would you, if a friend came to you with this issue, how would you respond to them? Or how would you talk to a friend in a situation like this? Right? We are much nicer to our friends than we are to ourselves, right? And so when we even just allow them that moment to be like, you're right, I would never talk to my friend like that. I wouldn't even, some of my enemies, I don't even think I would talk to them like that. So why would I even treat myself like that? And making sure that they're taking care of themselves, especially at this time. And, you know, COVID-19 and the dual pandemic really has put all of our worlds upside down. And I think the biggest thing, and actually to connect back to what Callie said at the beginning, this feeling of isolation, that really happened to our staff during closure, of feeling isolated. Couldn't go to, you know, we're a place, so you couldn't even go to the museum. And being so far apart from each other when usually we're all together. And gosh, did we ever think we'd miss being together so much? And so what I did during that closure was I set up time on my calendar to call and check in on them, and that they were prepared for me. These were phone call meetings, but I specifically told them, yes, I'm going to give you updates on whatever we're doing, whatever updates we have at that moment. But I also want you to come to this phone call meeting with, topics would change, but they could be a new TV show you're watching, or a new song that you're listening to, or something you saw on your daily walk. And the reason why I made them come up with something that they were doing or maybe brought them joy is it was a great entry point to make that connection and feel a little less isolated, that they could talk to me about something outside of work, outside of this pandemic. And yes, I heard a lot about Tiger King, that I had to then watch Tiger King and get through that. But you know what, 10 times out of 10, while we were talking about the TV show or how the flowers were blooming in their neighborhood, they started to tell me about their fears and stressors, and it allowed us to have really vulnerable conversations. And now, as a leader, there were times where I had to be extremely vulnerable and tell them, I don't know what's going to happen. But what I've seen through that, because I've continued these as we've reopened to the public, now we can have them in person with masks on, 6 feet apart, but they're at least in person, is I've gotten so much feedback from the team that's saying that they really appreciate it. They've felt heard throughout this entire process. And that they wanted to keep them going, and that they've kind of reached out and requested them. And I think that's been really a really powerful thing as we reopened, that they did feel heard. And again, we're not necessarily talking about the PPP stuff or PPE or how we're going to keep visitors 6 feet apart. We are connecting and reminding ourselves that we are a team, and that I can realize that, you know what, they can't handle this right now because of X, Y, and Z, or someone else can pick that up. And that's something we work on as a team as well, is when one of us is down, who can pick up those fallen pieces. And it's through those pretty vulnerable talks that we have. So those are just a few exercises. And, you know, some of those exercises are as simple as breathing. Callie's exercise of getting us centered and thinking about what brought us here to these moments. But I think it's really important to see cultivating empathy and training your staff as empathy as a journey, and one that does not have an ending. There is not one training on empathy that you can do and call it a day. This is practice, because we show up as different people every day, right? Anything can change us and our emotions, right? So we have to continue to practice and see where our emotions are and how we respond to those things. So with that, I want to kind of conclude. I want to definitely answer some of these questions, but I want to kind of make a conclusion commitment statement before we go through some questions with all of you. So like I said, you know, this is a practice. So either in the chat or in your notes if you're taking notes, or you can even whisper this to yourself. You can even just keep it in your mind. That's totally fine too. I want you to take a moment and finish the sentence, I choose. It can be something as big and as wonderful as I choose to act with love. I choose to listen. You can be really practical and say, I choose to apply one of the new skills or ideas that I learned at the VEX conference. Your commitment might be intricate, which is fine. And it's just as fine as it's simple, like I choose to breathe. But take a moment and find it for yourself, whatever it is. I choose. And then I want you to repeat it to yourself and consider it already done. You've made this commitment. Feel what it feels like that it's now, it's done, right? You're doing it. And we'll just go ahead before we open up all these great questions. We'll just seal it with a nice inhale in and exhale. Wonderful. All right. So how Callie and I have been doing some of these questions in some of our virtual programs for the cottage is we have asked people if they want to share it in their own voice by unmuting themselves and asking. So we for, you know, so it doesn't turn into chaos, I guess, we'll call out your names as well. Callie, I don't know if you saw some of these.
I did. I really liked, and I think Sarah Caswell and Michelle Stradley, I think the questions are very similar. But Michelle, yours came in first. So do you mind asking it with your voice if you're able to? Maybe there's Michelle. Are you able to ask it? Oh, there you are.
Yes. Just do you struggle with buy-in from staff with these trainings on cultivating this soft skill? In my experience, I've seen, especially from people who probably need it the most, a lot of eye rolling and joking about needing empathy and emotional intelligence, but almost even in them acknowledging that they need it, it's a way of distancing themselves from it. So I'm just curious how you approach that.
Yeah, and Sarah's takes that a step further too in saying, and what if they're not people that you've hired? So they're people who are already there. One thing I'll say about that, and Michelle, you jump in, please, but not knowing the variety of different sites that you all work for, museums that you all work for, I would bet in some way it's linked to justice or equity or some of these human rights and decency and issues like that. And I think that empathy is foundational to talking about any of these things. And so it really has to be a bedrock of these conversations and of the work that we're doing. And I think, sometimes there are words like emotional intelligence or phrases or, like that, or empathy or even feelings that really, it's the word that sets people off, maybe more so than the practice. And so, finding other ways to talk about this that don't use words that people might think are trendy or buzzy. We had a situation where, we had an interpretive piece that used the word privilege, that Lincoln used his privilege to, and we had some staff who sort of rolled their eyes a little bit about that. And we always have conversations about it, but realizing that a lot of times it's the word that sets people off rather than the idea or the practice. And that if we can present these things as sort of non-negotiables, but, and as I said, as foundational to the larger conversations that our sites are trying to have, then, hopefully you would be able to get a little further. Michelle, I don't know what you would add to that, but.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the words we use, absolutely. I think, especially if you're introducing that, a lot of people totally eye roll and things like that. One resource that you can look at that gives some really great, strong, this is for the people that consider themselves almost just only logical, which is impossible because we're human, is Permission to Feel by Mark Brackett. He is from the Center of Emotional Intelligence. Oh, you have it right there.
Oh, it's always like I have it. I use this all the time. It is such a great book.
So I absolutely love that book. And he works at Yale. And let me tell you, they've got some issues themselves about accepting emotional intelligence. And he goes through that, and at workplaces that are very different from museums, but in that idea of, I think someone was talking about old models of management, and he goes through a lot of studies that prove it and why it's important. His argument is really well laid out. I appreciate that a lot. I saw Pam had a really great question about the ones that actually I should ask Pam, would you like to, if you're able to read your own question with your own voice?
Sure. I had my camera off because I was eating lunch. I didn't think anybody wanted to watch that. I'm naturally empathetic, and working in interpretation and wading into heavy topics with visitors sometimes is exhausting. So I'm wondering, if you're asking your staff to bring their empathy skills to work, are you also helping them with boundaries and resiliency? And what are you doing to help with that?
Yeah, absolutely, Pam, thank you. And it totally depends on what you're eating if we want to see it. If it was delicious, I want to. But no, you're right. Being naturally empathetic, it's so exhausting. And so there are boundaries that we put in place. So some of those are allowing them to take breaks. At President Lincoln's Cottage, we talk about slavery. And we are very honest and very truthful about what that is, what that was too, is and was. We talk about modern slavery as well, and then also the repercussions of racism in the world today. And that's exhausting. So taking breaks and learning which staff needs what skills. And again, this is practice. So does one staff member need to vent? Does another staff member need to go walk around the grounds? Does one staff member need to go call someone and talk about it? They don't want to talk to you about it. And just making sure, like, okay, what are the things that can bring you comfort right now? And also, reminding them that they need to take time for themselves at home. We talk about that a lot at the cottage. We also do things like I get all the visitor compliments because everybody loves positive feedback and reminding them. Everybody's got a folder and like, wow, you just had this really tough conversation that you felt like didn't go well, but let's remember the conversations that did go really well. And then also having, I think, partners there as well, that it doesn't have to go on to the managers. You know, Callie is obviously my partner. So if I'm having an issue, I can ask for her help, but realizing, you know, with our team now, I've said like, is there a staff person that you can go to that you feel like can support you in this moment? And that they immediately are like, oh yeah, blah, this person, and making sure that they are supporting each other within the team as well. And also being vulnerable, that we all have moments where we can't show up 100% as well.
Yeah, I wanted to add to just put I know Nicole has reappeared, so that must be that time is up, but just to put a point on the, you know, the idea about old models of management being antithetical to empathy, and it's so, so true. But I think that, you know, this pandemic, if it has shown me anything as a leader, it's that I couldn't show up pretending like I had all the answers and not being vulnerable with people, because I don't. And that would have just further created a barrier. It doesn't mean that we have to sit around and like, you know, cry all day, but I am here if Michelle has needed to do that, or, you know, anybody. But I think that, you know, just recognizing that sometimes empathy is saying, I don't have a clue what's going to happen, but I trust us and I trust this team. And I know that if anybody can figure this out, we can do this. We've done hard things before, we can do hard things again. And, you know, I think that's been really important over the last few months.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. Our time is up, but the recorded session will be available to attendees after the conference.